Okay. All right, I want to welcome everyone. A few who I haven't met before, so welcome to Anshe Shalom, welcome to tonight's lecture, and once again, my great pleasure to introduce Malka Simkovich.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Does everyone have a source sheet? Okay, wonderful. 2 weeks ago, if you were here, we spoke about the history of Hanukkah and its reception history in ancient sources. And tonight we're going to speak about Jewish conflicts with the Roman Empire. And it might seem that these two topics are not related, but in fact they are very closely related, because even though the sources that we will be looking at are primarily 1st century CE sources, and the texts that we looked at 2 weeks ago were from the 2nd century BCE, one of the main arguments that I'm going to make tonight is that the rebellions that happened over and over and over in the 1st century and into the 2nd century CE were in attempt to reenact the Hasmonean success that occurred in the 2nd century BCE. So the Hasmonean dynasty ended in 63 BCE. That's when Roman made Judea a Roman province. But they allowed the Jews in Judea to have a sort of artificial monarchy. So there were still kings of Judea, but they were not autonomous kings. They were paying tribute to the Roman Empire. So the most famous of these kings is Herod. And after Herod, we have a long Herodian dynasty. Herod becomes the king, but again, it's sort of a puppet king position because he has to pay heavy taxes to the Roman emperor. He has to answer to the Roman emperor. He's called a king, but his kingly privileges are limited. And the Herodian dynasty goes through the middle of the 1st century. But once the Jews are under the Roman Empire, starting in 63 BCE, there immediately becomes an attempt to again attain autonomy, like there was autonomy starting in 175 to 164 BCE. So there's this attempt to return back to the good old days of being on our own, of not having to pay tribute, of not being under the thumb of the Romans. And so we see over and over and over this Jewish resistance to being under the Roman Empire. But another very important point that I want to make now, and that we will see throughout the sources tonight, is that the Roman Empire is foundationally different than the Greek Empire. I think sometimes in yeshiva day schools, small children, or at least I as a child, was taught all of our enemies were the same, they all just wanted to destroy us, and in every generation you have people who hate the Jews, and it's all irrational, and they're all kind of the same. But the Greeks and the Romans were very different from one another. And there are the stereotypes, which are true to a certain extent, that the Greeks were very well known for their philosophical schools, for their gymnasia, for their art, for their culture, for their writings, for their plays. And again, this is a stereotype, but the Romans were known for their iron weaponry and their armies and their military organization and their the way that they cruelly crucified people who either committed treason or somehow defected to the empire. That was a whole new thing. The Greeks didn't do crucifixion. So there are these stereotypical differences, but there's another difference that I think is very much overlooked when we think about Jewish life under the Roman Empire versus Jewish life under the Greeks, and that is that the Roman kings, the Roman emperors, demanded that they be treated as gods. And this makes a huge difference for how the Jews relate to the Roman Empire. It starts with Caesar to an extent, but really the person who institutionalizes this idea of a Roman emperor being like a god is his successor, is Octavian, who renames himself Augustus, revered one. And after Octavian, that's the very end of the 1st century, after Octavian, we sort of go down the slope of a more and more striking demand on the part of the Caesars to be treated like gods, and then after their deaths, as gods. And this culminates with Gaius Caligula, who was the emperor between 37 and 41. See, he was notoriously unstable. That's an understatement. Caligula, have you heard of him? If you've heard of him, then you've heard of the stories about him. Notoriously capriciously cruel, and just cruel, but not only to the Jews, to the people in his court. Caligula demanded that the Jews place an idol of his own image in the Jerusalem temple. It caused a big uproar, but Caligula expected to be worshipped in the same way that other gods in the Roman pantheon were worshipped. This was a huge problem for many Jews, perhaps not all Jews, but for many, many Jews. And so what I want to do tonight is put the Jewish rebellion that we do know about, that all of us know about, the Jewish rebellion that happened between the years 66 and 70 CE that culminated in the destruction of the temple. I want to put that into a context and show how that this was not an isolated event, a 4-year event that occurred in this vacuum, but starting at the end of the 1st century BCE, over and over and over and over, the Jews and the Romans are in conflict with one another. Now, to say the Jews are rebelling suggests, perhaps incorrectly, that the Jews are constantly initiating the rebellion, but really at this point it's a cycle. The Romans are antagonizing, the Jews are getting upset, the Romans are antagonizing more, the Jews are rebelling. So we're already in the cycle by the beginning of the 1st century. Now, we do have some emperors who really sought to achieve stability and peaceful relations with the Jews, and the two that did this most effectively are Tiberius, who came after Augustus and before Caligula, Tiberius, the very beginning of the 1st century, and Claudius, who came right after Caligula. There's no test. You don't need to memorize anything, but there were these two emperors. So what we're going to do tonight is look at all these little incidences, try to create some sort of mental timeline for ourselves to understand what the 1st century was like and what really happened in the Jewish rebellion in 66 to 70 CE, and how does it relate to the events before it. More than that, I will also suggest that the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was not as catastrophic as the rebellions that came after it in 118 and 135. In 135, the Bar Kokhba rebellion led to probably over 200,000 Jewish deaths. So 135 is really where this period of rebellion and constant clashing ends, and the rabbis take a formal position against military resistance towards the Roman Empire. And you see it in rabbinic literature. You see this resistance towards rebellion. And so tonight we're going to sort of give the background to that rabbinic resistance. Everybody have a source sheet, right? Some of you came in, and don't hesitate to, okay. All right, our first source is Cicero, correct? I want to make sure that we're all, okay. I think that when I came last year, I gave you this source because it's one of my very favorites. Already, this is the very, very beginning of the period in which Judea is a Roman province. And right at the very beginning, there are problems. Cicero, one of the most famous orators, gives a speech to the Roman Senate saying there are Jews all over the Roman Empire. There are Jews living in the biggest cities in the empire, in Rome and in Alexandria, in Egypt and in Antioch, all over the Roman Empire. And they're sending money to Jerusalem to support the Jerusalem temple, and that is financially unacceptable for us. They're basically sending all of these funds to the Nebraska of the Roman world, the land of Israel. Why do we want all of our gold being exported, exported? Is that the right word? Being sent over there. So Cicero gives a speech supporting legislation to ban the export of gold to Jerusalem. And the reason why I want to start with this speech is because of its date. It really reveals the fact that from the very beginning, the Romans, this isn't a Jewish source, the Romans are aware that the Jews, maybe their loyalties are divided. Maybe they are not ideal Roman citizens. Why are they not donating this money to support the Roman emperor? They're sending it to the wrong direction. And so Cicero is advocating for the prohibition of exporting gold. I keep saying exporting, but it doesn't sound like the right word to me. Sending gold.
Exportation.
There's so many other words I could use, so I'll try to use them all tonight. Okay, so Cicero says, it was the practice each year to send gold to Jerusalem on the Jews' account from Italy and all Arab provinces. By the way, he's an expert speaker, and the way that he's already presenting this is very clever and misleading. The Jews send gold from Italy and all our provinces. Now, historically speaking, the majority of Jews in the diaspora were not in Italy. They were probably in Alexandria and other parts of Egypt, perhaps in Antioch. There were Jews in Rome. But the way that he frames this is they're taking it out of the seat of the Roman Empire. They're taking it out of Italy and putting it in Jerusalem. Probably there was only a small percentage of Jewish money coming from Italy. But he presents it as a direct threat and a direct conflict. There's Italy/Rome versus Jerusalem. So he's already setting the stage for a conflict. But Flaccus is the Roman consul who initiated the legislation to ban sending gold, and so Flaccus is being defended by Cicero. So Cicero says, Flaccus issued an edict forbidding its export from Asia. Asia doesn't mean Asia as we think of it, it just means the Mediterranean area. Who is there, gentlemen, who cannot genuinely applaud this measure? The Senate strictly forbade the export of gold on a considerable number of previous occasions. I don't know if that's true, I don't have the historical evidence for that, but if Cicero says, perhaps it is true. To oppose this outlandish superstition was an act of firmness and to defy in the public interest the crowd of Jews that on occasion sets our public meetings ablaze was the height of responsibility. So what is this outlandish superstition? He's calling Judaism a superstition. This was not careless. This is extremely intentional. This is a Latin word, superstitio. It comes in direct, it's the exact opposite of religio, of the legitimate religion of Rome. And in the Roman world, religion was public. Religion was political. If you were a good citizen, you were going to go to that public festival of Dionysus and walk in the thank you. I was going to say promenade. Procession is the word I was hoping for. Yes, thank you. Walk in the procession of the festival of Dionysus. If you were a good Roman citizen, you would go to these festivals, you'd go to these events, you would go to, well, the Colosseum wasn't built until the end of the first century, but you would go see these grand events, and religion was not separated from public life. And so when Cicero calls Judaism a superstition, he's taking all the Jews and he's putting them outside the world of Roman politics. And he's saying they can't legitimately participate in our world because they're a superstition. They're not a religio. They're not a legitimate religion. And so he says to oppose this superstition was an act of firmness and to defy in the public interest the crowd of Jews that on occasion sets our public meetings ablaze. So this suggests that there were times where Jews were protesting anti-Jewish legislation. The Jews that on occasion sets our public meeting ablaze. So to oppose those Jews is the height of responsibility. So already at the very, very beginning of this relationship between the Roman Empire and the province of Judea, we have this tension. The Romans are already discussing how are we going to relate to the Jews? Are they part of us? Are they something else? By the way, the legislation did not go through, and it was tried again in the beginning of the first century. Tiberius, who was an early first century emperor, allowed the export to go through. He was relatively friendly with the Jews. Okay. Now, one of the most important witnesses to life in the first century is Philo.
This source also suggests there's like a Jewish lobby, like there in Rome, in the Senate, like kind of clamoring for, is there truth to that? Is there?
There definitely is truth, although I don't know that it was so organized that I would call it a lobby. It could just be local Jews hearing, Cicero is going to give the speech tomorrow and it's not going to be good for the Jews, let's go. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say organized lobby like AIPAC. Mm-hmm. But there were Jews living in Rome, and in the same speech, Cicero says, I see a lot of Jews back there hovering beyond the men of the Senate, so I will lower my voice. So they don't hear me. So they don't have the satisfaction of being part of our little in crowd. So Cicero makes multiple references to the Jews that he's very self-conscious are there protesting him, and he's not happy about it. So a lobby, I wouldn't say it was that organized, but we do know that Jews did get together at certain points in the first century and went to Rome and appealed on behalf of the Jews. I'm not sure if I mentioned 2 weeks ago that Philo was in a delegation. We'll talk about it tonight. Okay. So Philo of Alexandria was born in about 20 BCE in Alexandria. And he died in 50 CE. He gives us more information about Alexandrian Jewry in the first century than any other writer. Thankfully, the church preserved his writings. Jews did not. And Philo talks about anti-Jewish riots that were absolutely devastating in the year 38 CE. In 38 CE, the riots against the Jews were so bad that synagogues were burned to the ground, Jewish homes were destroyed, thousands of Jews were killed, and it went on and on and on until about 41 CE. There was an incredible wave of violence in 38, but stability didn't really happen until Caligula died and Claudius, who was relatively good, took over. Claudius really achieved more stability than Caligula ever could. Now, technically, what instigated these riots was a visit from the grandson of Herod, Agrippa I. Agrippa I was a very unpopular Jewish king among the Romans. The reason is because he allied himself with the Pharisees. He was a Fermi. He was very devout, and he was very attached to his ancestral law. And there's even an amazing Mishnah about Agrippa, where he's reading, there's a requirement of the king to read from the Torah, and he's reading a verse from Deuteronomy that says, "You shall not appoint a stranger over you." This is in a Mishnah, and Agrippa starts to cry. And the rabbis in the synagogue comfort him, and they say, "Don't cry, Agrippa, you are our brother, you are our brother." Agrippa had a very close relationship with the rabbinic or the proto-rabbinic community, if you want to say, in the first century. Interestingly, though, because he was the grandson of Herod, and because he was actually brought up and educated in Rome before he became head of Judea, he was very close with the Roman court. So he had a great relationship with Tiberius. So he was an interesting character. And there was a few years ago, a really excellent biography. I think Daniel Schwartz wrote a biography on Agrippa. But besides that book, I'm not sure that we have much scholarship or research done on Agrippa, but he's very interesting because he really straddled both worlds. He spent many years in the Roman courts and very much an insider in the world of Tiberius and later Caligula, and yet he was really a friend of the rabbis. But the Roman citizenship didn't know what to do with him. They thought of him as a backwards, old school, unpatriotic Jew, and why are the emperors kowtowing? Why are they cozying up to this guy? And so when Agrippa visited Alexandria in 38, he visited Alexandria on the way from Rome, traveling to the land of Israel, and his visit instigated anti-Jewish riots, where they basically took a town fool, and I'm not sure what I have in this worksheet, but we'll read some, so I might be repeating what we're going to read. But they took a town fool and they dressed him up as a king, and they paraded him through the streets of Alexandria, and they called him Agrippa. And first it was very mocking and insulting, and then it turned violent and murderous. And Philo, who was by this time an older, well-established, very well-regarded intellectual in the Jewish community in Alexandria, but so well-respected that he was also well-known among the Greeks, Philo was sent as part of a 5-person delegation to go to Caligula in Rome and ask him to intervene on the part of the Jews. And of course, Caligula basically laughed in their faces and said, you won't put an idol, well, I don't think he said idol, but you won't put an image of me in your Jerusalem temple. You won't worship me properly, and now you expect me to intervene. Have a nice life. Goodbye, buddy. Caligula, he basically slammed the door in their faces, and this is all recounted in a treatise that Philo wrote called On the Embassy to Gaius. But on Flaccus, this treatise that I have in source 2, Philo talks about the events that happened in Alexandria, specifically the riots, and the responsibility that the Roman consuls had in allowing it to happen. In particular, there was this one procurator, Flaccus, not to be confused with the one that Cicero is defending, who lived a century earlier and wanted to ban sending gold to Jerusalem. So this Flaccus was the procurator of Alexandria, like the mayor. He had to report back to the Roman emperor, and he was watching these anti-Jewish riots explode throughout the city, and he's watching synagogues be on fire, and he sat back and he did nothing. And perhaps Philo suggests he even instigated the riots. So Philo writes a treatise, a very angry, very impassioned treatise, about how Jews are so so loyal and such good Roman patriots, and yet no one intervened on their behalf. And of course, reading this as 21st century readers, there are some haunting parallels to our time. And the one thing I would suggest, which I don't have on the source sheet, is that he says at the very, very end of Embassy to Gaius, he says, this is a letter that he sent to Gaius after he was turned away, and he went back to Alexandria and he wrote this treatise, and it's set up as a letter to Gaius Caligula. He says, if you don't intervene on behalf of the Alexandrian Jews, every other synagogue in the Roman Empire is at risk. Because Alexandria was the New York City of its day. It was known as the biggest and the most thriving and the most flourishing Jewish community. And if there would be tens of thousands of Jews murdered, then that would be the green light to the rest of the Roman world to turn on the Jews in their own communities. And so Philo feels the urgency, the global urgency of the situation. Okay, so let's look at source number 2. Here he describes what happened. And what we're doing tonight is we're going through all these conflicts in the first century so that we really can put the Jewish rebellion that happened in 66 in a context. Because what happened in Alexandria does relate to what happened in the land of Israel. There was enough, I would say, of a globalized empire. At this point, the Jews were communicating with one another. What happened in one part of the empire did affect what happened in another part of the empire. I mean, Agrippa's visit to Alexandria is a great example. Even though he was only the ruler of Judea, he was well known throughout the empire. Okay, so I'm not sure. We have so much material here, so I'm not sure that I want to read all of this. But all right, does somebody want to read for the lazy and unoccupied mob in the city, that paragraph? And someone who has a loud voice.
Rabbi.
For the lazy and unoccupied mob in the city, a multitude well-practiced in idle talk who devote their leisure to slandering and evil speaking, was permitted by him to vilify the king, whether the abuse was actually begun by himself or caused by his incitement and provocation addressed to those...
Now there are a lot of pronouns here, so him is Flaccus and the king is Agrippa. Sorry, keep going.
Okay, who were his regular ministers in such matters. Thus, started on their course, they spent their days in the gymnasium jeering at the king and bringing out a succession of jibes against him. In fact, they took the authors of farces and jests for their instructors, and thereby showed their natural ability in things of shame, slow to be schooled in anything good, but exceedingly quick and ready in learning the opposite. Why did Flaccus show no indignation? Why did he not arrest them?
This is typical Philo. Long sentences, really ruminating, taking his time, building up the drama. He's very loquacious. So he's very upset that Philo did not intervene. I'm not going to do the second paragraph. But I will do the next paragraph on the top of page 2. I'll read it. After the pillaging and eviction and violent expulsion, so the Jews who were not killed, many of them were kicked out of the city. From most parts of the city, the Jews were like beleaguered men with their enemies all around them. They were pressed by want and dire lack of necessities. They saw their infant children and women perishing before their eyes through a famine artificially created. So what's happening here is that they're being cut off from their jobs. They're being told that they can't live in their homes. Many of them were stranded in the wilderness outside of the city of Alexandria. They had to go to relatives. There were thousands of Jews in 38 CE were expelled from the city. So the reason why this is so tragic for Philo, obviously he's a citizen of the city, but the Alexandrian Jews were known to have representatives from their own community studying in the philosophical schools, interacting with philosophers, learning Greek at very high levels. Even if you read Philo alone, you'll see how much of a Greek education he got based on his excellent Greek. And if you look at the Apocrypha, the text in the Apocrypha or in any ancient text that is thought to have been written in Egypt, generally, by a Jew, generally the Greek is very, very, very good. For example, 2 Maccabees, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, is preserved in Greek, thought to have been written in Egypt. The Greek is excellent, and there's no way that the writer did not have some sort of formal Greek education. So Philo perceives the Jewish community as being integrated in the broader Roman world and involved and an asset to the world of Alexandria, and then their neighbors turned on them, and he feels betrayed. Look at section 68. Whole families, husbands with their wives, infant children with their parents, were burnt in the heart of the city by these supremely ruthless men who show no pity for old age nor youth, nor the innocent years of childhood. Now, Philo really should be taken historically at face value because he's writing for people who were there. So it's not like Josephus, who wrote at the end of the first century, but he wrote this massive volume, The Antiquities of the Jews, and it starts at the beginning of time, right? It starts with Genesis, and he's going through all biblical history, and then he goes through Second Temple history. And so with Josephus, you might say, well, the people who were reading Josephus they weren't there in the 4th century BCE. So Josephus was not an eyewitness, neither were his readers. And so in Josephus, there's definitely polemical material, there's hyperbolic material, and he's working with sources that may be accurate or maybe slightly not accurate. But Philo has to be careful with his descriptions because he's writing for people who were there. So we should take this very seriously. Now he does aggrandize his language, and his Greek is very stylized, but in terms of the facts of what he's providing here, we have to take it very seriously. This is what happened. When they lacked wood for fire, the people who wanted to kill the Jews, they would collect brushwood and dispatch them with smoke rather than fire. Thus contriving, so they ran out of wood to use to burn down their houses and synagogues. Thus contriving a more pitiable and lingering death for the miserable victims, whose bodies lay promiscuously half-burnt. So this was the situation in Alexandria. Now, you can imagine the lingering trauma in the decades following this. It's basically, to use an anachronistic term, it's a pogrom, right? And so you can imagine the lingering resentment and also the ambivalence that the Jews in the diaspora, not just in Alexandria, but the Jews all over the Roman Empire felt. They had, on the one hand, affiliated themselves with the Roman Empire, and in the Jerusalem temple throughout the 1st century, every day there was a daily sacrifice on behalf of the emperor. Every day there was a temple sacrifice. So on the one hand, they felt, we are good patriots, we are loyal, we pay taxes, and yet we are being treated as if we're enemies of the state. And this was very confusing and very upsetting for the Jews. Now, when Claudius took over after the death of Caligula in 41, he did temporarily achieve stability. And we have a very fascinating papyrus here, and this is source 3. This papyrus was not discovered until 1924, and it's a letter that he wrote to the Alexandrian community, and part of the letter regards the Jewish question. What do we do with this ongoing conflict? Which tells us that even after the riots were technically over, there was still this incredibly high level of tension. We don't have the letter that was sent to Claudius that he is answering. So he's responding to Roman leaders in Alexandria. We don't know exactly what they said. We don't have their original letters, but we can figure it out based on what he says here. So he says, as for the question, which party was responsible for the riots and feud, or if the truth be told, the war with the Jews? Actually, that Greek, that Greek could also be war against the Jews, which would make a very big difference in terms of how you understand what he's saying. Although in confrontation with their opponents, your ambassadors, and particularly Dionysius, the son of Theon, contended with great zeal, nevertheless, I am unwilling to make a strict inquiry, though guarding within me a store of immutable indignation against whichever party renews the conflict. And I tell you once and for all that unless you put a stop to ruinous and obstinate enmity against each other, I shall be driven to show what a benevolent prince can be when turned to righteous indignation. So what is Claudius saying here? Reading between the lines. It's a great find that this is like a relatively modern discovery. So on the surface, it looks like he's blaming both sides equally. But can you find any clues as to maybe Claudius is blaming one side more than the other? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he is blaming both sides equally. Why does Claudius not want to make a strict inquiry? There's no test. You don't have to. There's no right answer. Well, there's some. He doesn't want to make it right because he doesn't.
Everyone knows what the answer is. So.
He doesn't want to be in a position where he has to bring to trial, right, and his allies, right. And also, who is the letter addressed to? It's not addressed to the Jews.
Yeah.
Right.
The reference to Dionysus is clearly.
Yeah, although there were some Jews with Roman names, but he's not a Jew.
What's pushing you not to take it at face? I mean, as a parent, often you're like, I don't care who's right or who's wrong. I just like you have to stop right now. Like stop the fighting right now. Like we don't care who's right or wrong. Why? That's how I read it. What's pushing you to see him as?
I think that this is a letter to Roman officials, Gentile Roman officials, and he's saying this has to stop. He's not addressing it to Alexandrian Jewish leaders, which makes me, and he knows of the Alexandrian Jewish leaders, which makes me think that he does know, especially this line, I'm unwilling to make a strict inquiry, but I'm telling you that you have to take responsibility for making sure that it stops. I think that the subtext here is that Claudius is holding them responsible. That's my reading of it. I do see that there is ambiguity, but he's addressing this to Romans. And he's saying you have to make sure that it stops.
If they have the power to make it stop, then they're the ones who are responsible.
Well, especially because Flaccus was the one who, even if he wasn't himself picking up arms, he was sitting back and watching the whole thing happen. And Claudius says, no, that you can't do that. Well, even in the time of Claudius, there were rebellions against the Roman Empire, and these rebellions are really relatively unknown in terms of our yeshiva day school curricula and just, the broad strokes of Jewish history that we speak about. We speak about the Second Temple period and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and that's because the destruction of the temple looms so large in rabbinic tradition, but actually a lot happened before. And so Josephus is our main witness to these conflicts. Josephus is the late 1st century historian who lived in the land of Israel, and he was a general in the army. He was part of an important priestly Jerusalemite family, and he was given a garrison up north. And his experience as a general was totally catastrophic. He was responsible for the deaths of basically his entire brigade. They were besieged in a town called Jotapata, and he was taken captive, and at that moment, he was taken captive by General Vespasian, who was going to become emperor very soon. And at that moment, Josephus defects to the Roman Empire, and he realizes the Jews are waging a suicide mission. And so when Josephus, at the end of his life, writes the Jewish War, he's very, very conscious of, he's writing in Rome, and he has by this time taken on the name Flavius, Josephus Flavius, which is in homage to the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. And so he's very conscious of presenting the conflict as with as much empathy as he can muster towards the Romans, even though he's very careful about about defending the legitimacy of the Jewish religion. He's also highly sympathetic to the Romans. But look at source 4, what he talks about. Now this is in the middle of the reign of Claudius, and he's talking about Archelaus, which is one of the Jewish monarchs in Judea. And he says that during this time, Archelaus's territory was reduced. And look at the underlined, under his administration, a Galilean named Judas incited his countrymen to revolt, upbraiding them as cowards for consenting to pay tribute to the Romans and tolerating mortal masters after having God their Lord. This man was a sophist. It's like an insult when Josephus says it, who founded a sect of his town, having nothing in common with the others. So Josephus says, no, this guy had nothing to do with most people in the land of Israel, but he did try to rabble-rouse, and he did it on the pretense that they shouldn't be paying taxes to Rome. So what do you think about that? I'd like to return to this idea in the beginning of the talk that the Jews are not, at least some Jews, are not letting go of this idea that there can be a successful resistance. This does sound a lot like the account in 1 Maccabees, where the Greek general is about to loot the temple treasury, and Mattathias gathers his family, and he says, you only serve God, you don't serve a mortal. So there is perhaps this idea that we can return to those times. I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it, but there does seem to be a pattern of these individuals coming up and saying, we don't owe Rome anything. And certainly this idea that we treat the emperors as gods is even, it's totally unacceptable to many of the more traditional Jews. Okay, now Nero was Claudius's successor, and Nero was extremely cruel. He was famous for killing his mother, and he killed other members of his court. Have you heard of the phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned? Now there's a theory, I don't know if this is true, I wasn't there in the first century, that he was responsible for starting this big fire. He was actually responsible for it because he built for himself a huge palace known as the Golden House. And it took up almost half of the city of Rome. And until Nero's time, the emperors, or the Caesars, lived in relatively modest housing, and Nero said, I'm going to make this grand palace. And there was a conspiracy theory that started in maybe the 3rd century, maybe earlier, we really don't know if this is true, but that he burned down half of Rome to make room for this palace. Now the palace is partially excavated. You can go online and look at pictures of Nero's Golden House. And so he definitely did use parts of the burned down area of Rome to build his own house. So make of that what you will. But Nero was not popular. He was using government funds to build this extravagant palace and killing people that he was suspicious of. Nero was just a tricky guy. Tricky guy. Okay. So in Alexandria, apparently things had not died down permanently. Josephus tells us that during Nero's reign, there was another outbreak against the Jews. And Josephus says, and this is source 4, on one occasion when the Alexandrians were holding a public meeting on the subject of an embassy which they proposed to send to Nero, a large number of Jews flocked into the amphitheater along with the Greeks, their adversaries. The instant they caught sight of them, the Greek semicolon, I should have read that better. Their adversaries, the instant they caught sight of them, raised shouts of enemies and spies and then rushed forward to lay hands on them. The majority of the Jews took flight and scattered, but 3 were caught by the Alexandrians and dragged off to be burned alive. So things are not good in Alexandria in the 1st century. Thereupon the whole Jewish colony rose to the rescue. They hurled stones at the Greeks, so the Jews are defending themselves and fighting that. And then snatching up torches, rushed to the amphitheater, threatening to consume the assembled citizens in the flames to the last man. And then after that, Rome responds by sending in troops who killed many Jews. Look down to the second half of the 2nd paragraph. There was no pity for infancy. Do you see that? So the Roman officials are sent in, and they kill many Jews, even Jews who had not gone to the amphitheater. They just kill Jews. No respect for years, all ages fell before their murderous career until the whole district was deluged with blood and the heaps of corpses numbered 50,000. Now, I don't know if that's hyperbolic or not. I don't know. That's what Josephus tells us. Even the remnant would not have escaped had they not sued for quarter. Alexander, now moved to compassion, ordered the Romans to retire. Alexander is sort of like the Flaccus. He's the procurator of the city. They broke to obedience, ceased massacring at the first signal, but the Alexandrian populace, so even after the soldiers were told to stop killing Jews, the populace, in the intensity of their hate, Josephus says, were not so easily called off and were with difficulty torn from the corpses. This is Josephus. Josephus, who usually writes a pretty straight, objective history, here gives us some horrific images about what was happening in Alexandria in the middle of the 1st century. Now we will move our camera lens back to the land of Israel and see that in the land of Israel there's also a great amount of unrest. And I have a lot of information here from Josephus about what were the events that led up to the Jewish war, as we call it. I will not read this line by line to you, don't worry. But there is something that I want to bring your attention to, and I don't think that it's in this section of Josephus. I think it's actually before this passage starts. I mentioned a few minutes ago that there was a daily sacrifice to the emperor in the Jerusalem temple. one of the big instigators of the war between the Romans and the Jews is that some Jewish individuals who wanted to rebel against the Roman Empire and achieve autonomy said we have to stop bringing the sacrifice. And there was a movement among Jews, a lobby, if you will, to stop the sacrifice, the daily sacrifice to the emperor. And when the Roman authorities got wind of this plan that they were no longer going to bring a daily sacrificial tribute on behalf of the emperor, that was the first break. That was when the ball got rolling towards all-out war. But Josephus says it was basically a confluence of different events. History is not linear. It's not A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. It's that 15 things come together at the same time and explode. And so what we have here in 66 CE in the land of Israel is many things happening at the same time. And so as there is this lobby against the sacrifice to the empire, there's also antagonism between Jews and non-Jews in the land of Israel that's becoming borderline violent. And so one interesting incident is told at the beginning of source 5 when Josephus says that in Caesarea, in a town in the north of Israel, on the Sabbath, so now I'm going to read, when the Jews assembled at the synagogue, and by the way, that's like a little historical nugget that they're going to Shul on Shabbos in the first century. That's very interesting. It's fun to look for those little things that we often, our eyes pass over, but they're going to Shul on Shabbos and they're davening and they're reading the Torah. I don't know what they davened, but they were definitely reading from the Torah. That we know actually from the New Testament. Okay, they found that one of the Caesarian mischief makers, so a non-Jew, had placed beside the entrance of the synagogue a pot, turned bottom upwards, so an upside down pot, upon which he was sacrificing birds. Why was he doing that? He was making fun of the Jews. This spectacle of what they considered an outrage upon their laws and a desecration of the spot enraged the Jews beyond endurance. He was standing outside the synagogue killing birds on a pot, killing them probably with a knife, and maybe perhaps pretending to be a Jewish priest in the temple. Whatever he was doing, the Jews, as Josephus tells us, were enraged. They felt so antagonized, and they complained to Gessius Florus, the Roman procurator of Judea from 66, who was from 64 to 66. And Gessius Florus was Josephus hates this guy. I'm just to put it in colloquial terms. He, like Flaccus in Alexandria, refused to ever intervene on behalf of the Jews. And so when the Jews came to him and said, there's this guy who's harassing us outside of our synagogue, killing birds on Shabbos, and then pretending to be a Jewish priest, please help, get rid of this guy. He absolutely refuses. And then look at the last line of that first paragraph. Florus actually had them arrested, the Jews who complained to him about this guy. And I encourage you to read this line by line at home. It's 8:45. Florus had these Jews arrested and put them in irons on the charge of having carried off the copy of the law of Caesarea. I'm not sure what that means. I have to go back to that. But this news roused indignation at Jerusalem, though the citizens still restrained their feelings. So there's this feeling that the Romans are antagonizing the Jews. And Florus, as if he had contracted to fan the flames of war, sent to the temple treasury and extracted 17 talents. So not only does he arrest the Jews who are complaining to him, but then he goes to the temple treasury and he takes money. That sounds very much like the beginning of 2nd Maccabees, when the Greeks are coming in and taking money out of the Jerusalem temple. Now, I'm not saying this isn't true. I'm just saying that there's an interesting historical parallel here. So Florus how do I put this lightly? I don't know how to say this politely, so I won't say it at all. But a very not nice phrase. He's saying, blank you. I'm going to arrest your people, and then I'm going to take your money after. So Florus is not a nice guy, right? And Josephus feels that Florus is trying to get the Jews to rebel so that he can then have an excuse to call up Rome and bring in the cavalry and just put them to bed and get rid of the Jews. Are you following? Josephus feels that Florus is trying to make war. And when Josephus retells the story, even though he's sympathetic to Rome, and he's writing in the 90s CE in Rome, and throughout he's sympathetic to Rome, when he talks about Gessius Florus, Josephus is angry, and he can't hold back, and he's not sympathetic to him. So you really feel the emotion when you read Josephus' account of what happens here. After that, and again, we're not going to go through all of this, but look at, on page 5, section 4, the priests of the temple come out in a procession trying to make peace with the Roman officials that Gessius Florus has brought in from Rome. And the priests of Jerusalem, the Jews of Jerusalem, come out onto the road to meet the Roman officials. And they're trying to make some sort of treaty. We don't want war with you. Please, let's put the tensions to rest. So look at section 4. Then it was that every priest and every minister of God, this is like a Hail Mary. Is that what it is in football, where you just like put all your risk out there? I have never watched a game of football in my life. It's like high risk, right? Okay, so they're putting all their priests out there and to meet the Roman officials who are coming. And they're saying, we do not want peace. And they come in procession, and they're carrying holy vessels, and they're wearing the robes in which they were wont to perform. So they're wearing the priestly garments, and they have harpers and choristers, and they fall on their knees before the Romans that Gessius Florus has brought in. And they earnestly implore the people to preserve for them these sacred ornaments and not to provoke the Romans to pillage the treasure of the house of God. So they're telling everyone, calm down, do not rebel against Rome. And then when they finally meet the Romans, I have to find where this is. Look at section 5 at the bottom of the page. They advanced in quiet and orderly fashion to meet the troops, and on the approach of the latter saluted them. So the Jews saluted the Roman troops. The cohorts, the Romans making no response, the rebels started clamoring against Florus. So the Jews in the background, who are not the priests, are getting very, very upset. And this was the given signal for falling upon the Jews. So apparently there were Jews that were in cahoots with the Romans, and look what happens. In an instant, the troops were around them, striking out with their clubs, and on their taking flight, the cavalry pursued and trampled them under their horses' feet. All the priests were killed. Many fell beneath the blows of the Romans. So this peace procession that came out to greet the Romans, they were all killed. And that, for Josephus, is the beginning of the Jewish war. But again, it's a confluence of events. It's that there are Jews who are saying, we don't want to sacrifice to the emperor, and the Romans are getting wind of that, and so they're starting to talk about gathering military presence in the land of Israel. It's that the Jews are complaining to the Romans because other Romans are antagonizing them. So there's a lot going on. And then there's the intra-Jewish tension between some Jews who are sympathetic to the Roman cause and other Jews who want to resist Roman dominance over them. And so there are all these things happening at the same time. But at the moment that peace procession is murdered, is wiped out for Josephus, that's the moment that war begins. And so again, I'm trying to put all this into a larger context of tensions that are occurring not only in the land of Israel, but all over the Roman Empire. And it goes on past 70 CE. It goes on until 135 CE. There are 2 more wars that happen in the Roman Empire, and they happen not just in one location, but throughout the Roman Empire. So in 115, we have Jewish rebellions against the Roman Empire in many, many pockets of Rome happening simultaneously. This is known as the War of Quietus. Lucius Quietus was one of the generals, the Roman generals, who was most notorious for killing Jewish rebels and also Jewish innocents. And he's known in rabbinic literature as Kitos, the War of Kitos. So if you ever see that, that's Lucius Quietus. And this is the war that happens under Emperor Trajan. So Eusebius. Eusebius is a 4th century historian, Roman historian. Do you have a question, comment? Okay. And so Eusebius talks about this war of Quietus. It also is mentioned in Cassius Dio. And this is just a tiny little snippet that I'll read. The emperor suspected, so Trajan suspected that the Jews in Mesopotamia would also attack the inhabitants and ordered Lucius Quietus to clean them out of the province. So the Jews were rebelling against the Roman emperor, and on the pretense, or the Jews were rebelling against Roman officials, and on the pretense that they would turn on civilians, there was an edict given to Lucius Quietus to clean them out. So that's pretty ruthless. In one little sentence, you have an incredibly ruthless piece of legislation there. He organized a force and murdered a great multitude of the Jews there, and for this reform was appointed governor of Judea. So Eusebius is not at all empathetic to the Jewish cause, and he has only a very little snippet of information here, but the fact that he says that Lucius Quietus organized a force and murdered a great multitude of Jews, that's an understatement. Now Cassius Dio tells us a little bit more. Cassius Dio is actually earlier than Eusebius. He's a late 3rd century CE historian, also not even a little bit empathetic to Jews, but he's an historian, so he has his many sources and he's giving an account. Sometimes Cassius Dio is extremely hyperbolic, especially when he talks about the Bar Kokhba rebellion. He talks about Jews eating dead corpses, so we'll get to that. I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to get to that. Okay, so Cassius Dio here says, the Jews in the region of Cyrene, says in North Africa, had put a certain Andrew, at their head. So this is a reminder that in the ancient world, Jews, many of them had Greek names, Latin names, Andreas at their head, and were destroying both the Romans and the Greeks. Oh, it's here. But then he says it again later. They would eat the flesh of their victims, make belts for themselves of their entrails, anoint themselves with their blood, and wear their skins for clothing. Okay, we do not have to take this as historical evidence. This is propaganda. Many they sawed into from the head downwards. Others they gave to wild beasts, and still others they forced to fight as gladiators. In all, 220,000 persons perished. So he's talking about the Jews. The Jews did this to their enemies. In Egypt, too, they perpetrated many similar outrages, and in Cyprus, the island in the Mediterranean, under the leadership of a certain Artemian, there also 240,000 perished, and for this reason no Jew may set foot on that island. But even if one of them is driven upon its shores by a storm, he's put to death. So if you go to this island, if you go to Cyprus and you're a Jew, you're killed on sight. That is what Cassius Dio tells us. So again, what happened in 66 to 70 CE is part of a larger phenomenon in the Roman Empire of incredible unrest, and we don't see a parallel under the Greeks. We have this holiday Hanukkah, and it's 8 days long, and we always talk about the Syrian Greeks and the fight with the Greeks and separating from the Greeks. But historically, there's nothing like 150 years of constant clashing with a host empire. It doesn't happen under the Greeks. It doesn't. Now, yes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, when he came to power in the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, did bring in very oppressive legislation, yes. And that legislation was resisted. But we're talking about that's a 30-year rebellion against one individual. This is over and over in pockets all over the Roman Empire, regardless of who the emperor is. And this is just, it's happening all over. I'm going to skip this Talmudic text, but it's very interesting because it talks about the death of Trajan, and it makes it emphasizes the divine providence, and that Trajan's death was the result of God's rage against him. So it's interesting. But I want to end with the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Oh no, but I want to say one more thing. 117 to 118 is the end of Alexandrian Jewry. Trajan and the Romans who were responsible for putting down the rebellion, the Quietus, this rebellion that was happening all over the empire, they destroyed, they made what happened in 38 CE look like peanuts. They killed tens and tens of thousands of Jews, and in 118 CE, the Alexandrian Jews either ran away or were killed, and we have no more evidence of Jewish life in Alexandria. Done. Now in 135, again we have a rebellion. Now remember, we're living in a Messianic age where there are many, many Messianic figures, and the Jews and the early Christians are convinced that they're living on the cusp of the end time. And they need to act in a way that will be a harbinger, I don't know if I said that correctly, a harbinger to herald in the end time. And so Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kosiba, they're both polemical. They're both probably not his real name, because Bar Kokhba, son of a star, alludes to the verse in Numbers, this messianic figure will come to you. And Bar Kosiba means the bearer of deceit. That's what the rabbis called him. Kosiba means lies, deceit. So he amasses a huge following of Jews to rebel against the empire, but this leads to more deaths than any other conflict with the Roman Empire before it. And so the fall of Beitar, and that's just a heart-wrenching, I'm going to end with that, but I do hope that you read Cassius Dio on your own. But let's talk about the fall of Beitar. This is really just a heart-wrenching Talmudic text. Beitar was the last city to fall in this war against Rome in 135. It was the very last city to fall. And there's this verse, through the shaft of a litter Beitar was destroyed, and it's interpreted as follows. It was the custom when a boy was born to plant a cedar tree, and when a girl was born to plant a pine tree. And when they were married, this is very famous. Has anyone seen this? Okay. When they were married, the tree was cut down and a canopy was made of the branches. This is the Jewish tradition. One day, the daughter of the emperor, so this was the daughter of Hadrian, was passing when the shaft of her litter broke. So her carriage broke. So they lopped off some branches of a cedar tree and brought it to her. The Jews thereupon fell upon them and beat them, because this was someone's particular cedar tree that belonged to a woman who was going to be in her canopy when she got married, right? Because when girls were born, a cedar tree was always planted. So the Jews attacked her group of travelers, and they reported to the emperor that the Jews were rebelling, and he marched against them. He has cut off in fierce, this is another verse. He has cut off in fierce anger all the horn of Israel. Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rabbi Abahu, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, these are the 80,000 battle trumpets which assembled in the city of Beitar when it was taken, and men, women, and children were slain in it until their blood ran into the great sea, the Mediterranean. Do you think this was near? It was a whole meal, let's say a mile. It was a whole mile away. It has been taught. Rabbi Eliezer the Great said, there are two streams in the valley of Yadaim, one running in one direction and one in the other. And the sages estimated that at that time they ran with 2 parts water to 1 of blood. In a Beit it has been taught, for 7 years the Gentiles fertilized their vineyards with the blood of Israel without using manure. So, in the rabbinic memory, the story of Bar Kokhba was an unparalleled catastrophe. But the tensions began the day Judea became a Roman province. The relationship to their host empire was totally unlike their relationship to the host Greek empire. It was never stable for more than a decade. It was characterized by constant clashes, by the Jews having in the back of their minds always that they were expected to treat the emperor as a god. And this daily sacrifice to the emperor was a source of incredible tension. Now, of course, it depended on how you interpret it. If you were to say, we're bringing a sacrifice on behalf to pray for him for his welfare, that's fine. But what if the suggestion was something more, was that you were legitimizing his claim to being divine? Now, these issues, these questions, these tensions were never resolved. And each of these clashes were an attempt to, like I've been saying, to perhaps reenact, once again, the Hanukkah story. But Josephus was very clear. The Romans are not the Greeks. The Romans are, their military organization was unlike anything that the world had ever seen. And Josephus realized early on, we are not going to have another Hanukkah story here. And so I hope that these sources not only put the Jewish rebellion into a larger first century CE context, but they also help us to distinguish between the world of the Greeks and the world of the Romans. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
It seems from what I'm reading that the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire overlap for a period of time. Is that true?
In 63, the Greek Empire is basically gone. But the Romans are a presence, they're expanding already 2 centuries before that. But the word empire isn't really used until the time of Caesar. So that's the second half of So they're expanding and they're fighting wars and they're making treaties. That's already happening for 2 or 3 centuries. Yeah.
Were these pockets of Jewish
Resistance, yeah.
well, the towns or the areas where there were Jews, how long were they in existence? Did they precede the empire?
You mean, did the Jewish presence there precede the empire?
Right.
Absolutely, especially in the case of Alexandria. This is a big polemical point that Philo and Josephus both insist on. They say the day that Alexander the Great founded Alexandria, so that's at the end of the 4th century CE, Jews have been living there. Philo says this over and over. It's very important to him that his readers know that the Jewish presence has been around as long as the Greek and Roman presence, and that they weren't newcomers. That was definitely the case in Alexandria. And actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I wasn't going to do show and tell, but I happen to have a book in my bag called Jewish Life in Ancient Egypt, and this is just great pictures. I like pictures, easier than words. So these are great pictures of papyri that were found in Aramaic. Yeah, you can't see, but feel free after the talk to take a look. In Aramaic, and these are 5th century papyri. So even before Alexander, really starting from the Babylonian exile, when Persia takes over Babylonia in 539, and the Persians say, Jews who were put in captivity, go back and rebuild the second temple. It's that moment that the Jews start spreading out all over the world. And they say, well, we could go back to Judea and build the second temple, or we could go to Egypt, we could go to Antioch, we could go to Rome. And it's that moment, in 539 BCE, that the Jews are starting to see themselves as belonging to the broader world and not necessarily the land of Israel. And this is the whole book of Nehemiah is railing against this attitude. And Nehemiah is saying, why aren't you coming back to the land? Only 43,000 families came back to the land. You can imagine how many families stayed in Babylonia, and many of them stayed till the middle of the 20th century, right? Iranian Jews stayed. And Nehemiah is saying, why are you staying? But what is less addressed is that Jews were leaving Babylonia, but they weren't coming back to the land of Israel. Some of them came back to Egypt. And we have papyri written in Aramaic, and we have archaeological evidence, and we have documented evidence, written evidence that Jews were living all over the Roman Empire. And the Greek historian Strabo, who lived in the middle of the Second Temple period, says wherever you go in the empire, you can find a synagogue.
Why did these rebellions stop? What
The rabbinic community was extremely resistant to resistance. I don't know that the rabbis had such a global effect on all of Roman Jewry, but there was no Alexandrian Jewry, and that must have hit the other Jews living throughout the empire very hard. The Jews in Alexandria, that was the biggest Jewish community, not in the diaspora, but in the Roman world. There are some estimates that 1 million Jews were living in Alexandria. Philo says there are 5 sections of the city, and each section is named after a letter of the Greek alphabet. There's section alpha, section beta, section gamma, section delta, and section epsilon. Delta is all Jewish, and epsilon is Jewish, maybe not as all Jewish as delta, and there are synagogues in every section of the city. So, like I said, it was the New York City of the ancient world, and once they were decimated, I imagine that this was traumatic for everyone, but the rabbis really had a program of, maybe I wouldn't call it passivity, but of not resisting, not picking up arms. They definitely distanced themselves from Bar Kokhba, that's for sure. Any other questions? Yes?
Rabbinic antipathy to Rome. How much of that sentiment is based upon sort of what we're reading about here, general oppression and general violence? And then how much is more theological, saying, well, the Romans, they destroyed the temple? Because the rabbis, have mixed feelings about the old temple cult and rabbinic Judaism, and you even mentioned here that prayers at now called shuls existed outside of Jerusalem even before the destruction of the temple. And Jerusalem was evolving into a religion based on study and prayer,
Right.
even before the destruction of the temple.
Right.
So how much was there perhaps little rabbinic antipathy to the Romans' destruction of the temple per se?
I think it's both. And there were certain Roman codes of law that were instituted in the 4th and 5th century, the Code of Justinian and the Code of Theodosian, that were extremely anti-Jewish. Things like you can't build a new synagogue, and you can't practice your tradition in certain public places. So there was definitely some oppressive legislation.
That this was later, you're talking
4th and 5th century.
of the Common Era. This was much
Yes,
later,
yes,
right?
yes. Right. But in the time of the rabbis. Right? And that's
Correct.
the reason why probably the Yerushalmi Talmud was put together so hastily, is because it was a time of instability, and the rabbis wanted to write it down, and they wanted to disseminate it. That's one theory that I've heard. That it was the 4th and 5th century was a very, very hard time for the Jews living in the land of Israel. The other thing is that's a trend in modern academic circles, and I don't know if this is a trend that will catch on, but this idea that 70 CE was not necessarily a paradigmatic shift in Jewish history. So there's this book that Daniel Schwartz, again, edited called Was 70 CE a Watershed in Jewish History? Question mark. It gets to the point of what the book is. But it's a compendium of essays by different scholars, and I'm sure you can find it on Google Scholar. Was 70 CE a watershed in Jewish history? But the supposition of the title is that maybe not that much changed on, the day after. Obviously, in rabbinic literature, the temple looms very, very large. But perhaps by the end of the 1st century, the Sadducees were already on the way out, the Pharisees were already, rising to dominance. So these are new questions that scholars are asking. Yes?
What did the Jewish Christian community feel about Rome?
Oh, the Romans did not like the early Christians, and there are many thousands of Christian martyrs who were killed by the Romans. Christianity was illegal until the 4th century. So the Romans, at the beginning, looked at Christianity as a sect of Judaism, but they were actually more harsh to the Christians in the 1st and 2nd century, if you can believe it. They were more harsh to Christians than to Jews, and many, many Christians were martyred. And Christians, especially in the Catholic tradition, have feast days commemorating these martyrs all through the calendar year. And until Christianity became legalized in the 4th century, it was not fun to be a Christian in the Roman Empire.
But did they align themselves with the Jewish community before the split? So when the Christian community was still was Jewish, how did they align themselves with? Did they align themselves with like the Jewish nationalists?
I think that there were already churches in the middle of the 1st century. So there's the Church of Jerusalem that we see in the book of Acts in chapters 12 to 15. We see a lot of information about the Church of Jerusalem, and we have the church in Antioch, and they're sort of debating about to what degree do we align ourselves with halacha, do we keep kashrut, do we circumcise? But they're still separate congregations at that point. So it's a very, very tricky question. Where were they when the Romans were coming in and killing people? And I'm sure that there were casualties of war who were Christian. But by the early 1st century, there are churches. Now, we also know that in the 4th century, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, that there were Christian bishops who were telling their congregations, like John Chrysostom, I know you're going to shul on Saturday and church on Sunday. You got to stop it. So the parting of the ways didn't really happen until the 4th century. It's very, very hard to document who killed was a Jewish Christian and who was, full out Jew. And of course, there were Romans who were God-fearers who somehow affiliated with the Jewish religion. So these lines were really very artificial in the ancient world, right? Because you could go to church on Sunday, you could go to synagogue on Saturday, and the day before you could attend a festival of Dionysus. And I'm sure that there were Jews who did that. And there were God-fearers who kept Shabbat and then went to the temple of Jupiter and offered sacrifices. The world of Rome was very syncretistic. We have some very interesting examples of this in archaeology in Egypt, where you have a cult of Isis. You have temples that, actually even in this book, you have temples to Isis, but Isis looks Greekified. She looks Hellenized. So the world was very syncretistic. The Greeks were borrowing from the native Egyptians. The native Egyptians were borrowing from the Persians. But religion was public, and it was political. So for a Jew to say, I will not attend these public festivals, that was really taking a stand against the Roman Empire. I feel like I just complicated your question rather than answered it, but any other questions? All right, well, thank you
Thank you
so much.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you.